But secondly, who is to oversee what's being taught there? Not the pastors, not the elders, not the deacons. We start leaving it to people on their own. And quite simply, you never know exactly what's going to come out of it. But I've seen what comes out of it, and what comes out of it is trouble. Now, are there people today who are doing studies at their home who are doing awesome? Of course there is. Of course there is. But I have heard of so many that have brought those problems. And not only that, but I'll just tell you what else happens with a lot of them. They turn into gossip. Opportunities for a group to start out as a Bible study and turn into a schism, if you will, a clique. And before long, this clique and this clique over here are in competition with each other. All the while, nobody knows what they are teaching. It can be anything. Listen, some of the most popular literature that has been taught in Southern Baptist churches for the past 20 years is absolutely ungodly and should have never made it through the front door. There have been numerous Bible teachers, all of whom eventually get weeded out, but not before they sell millions of dollars worth of Bible studies for people to do at home and for groups to get together and do. And I know today there are churches that are having these small groups and stuff. All I can say is that you better make sure somebody who's in some kind of title close to elder has something to do with every one of them, because they go bad quick. I have a real problem with anybody teaching who operates outside of the structure of a church, period. And what happens is, I've talked about it before, but there used to be a place in West Kentucky where lots of people used to go. Never had anything to do with the church, but it had a great effect on the church. Because the people went, learned something that almost none of them's pastors ever agree with. And then they came back and tried to get it into their church. And eventually they had to start churches for the people who had gone and started to see things this way. They walked completely away from what they'd believed their whole life. Not completely away, but let's just say they strayed off into right field. I've said this before, and I mean it. The Lord does not call lone rangers. He founded the church because that's where the teaching and the preaching is supposed to take place. We got all kinds of work that we can do outside the church, but teaching and preaching is supposed to be centered around the church. Personal visitation, witness, evangelism, going out, starting up groups to try to recruit people into your church, that's all great. I'm 1,000% for it. But when it turns into schisms in the church, it proves that it should have never been done, and it brings them in a lot. When homes get deceived, they're going to drag that deception into their own congregations. And what you find is, when you get a group, sooner or later, somebody is going to become, if you'll pardon the expression, head cheese of that group. And before long, that person has a lot of authority. You know, in 1992, I believe it was. Is that the year we went to Ridgecrest? 92? Tiffany and I went to Ridgecrest in 1992. Went for a week of Southern Baptist worship and Sunday school training. And I was a Sunday school director at the time, and I wanted to learn more about it. It's amazing. One of the first things they taught you there was, don't let any of your Sunday school classes get too big. Don't let them get too big, because they become incredibly powerful. And the first thing they would teach you is, it's not the best way to grow your Sunday school anyway, because if you get 40 people in a class and you split that into two groups of 20, many times it won't be long before you have two groups of 40, where you used to only have one. But I literally one time was the teacher of a class that got so big that there were people who got a little bit concerned about it because there was too many people in it. And so we split it. I was approached about it, and I said, I don't disagree. You know, it's not easy. I'm going to tell you. You go try to tell church people, just go try to tell them, we're going to split this class, and we need half of y'all to go to another one. Just go try it sometime. And you're going to learn that it is not a very popular thing, but it works. It works all the time. And I want you to think, if there's a congregation of 200 people, and let's just think I had a Sunday school. I did. I had a Sunday school with 42 members. If I had enough sway on those 42 members, do you realize just how much power I have? If I'm a fifth of the whole church is, quote, my people, it can turn into a very serious situation. That's why Paul wants a church set up and done right. Because if you don't, it's going to become a problem. The Greek word there for their mouths must be stopped. I like this. Carries the idea of placing a gag in someone's mouth. Now, I will not lie. In 30 years, I have wanted to do that a few times. But let's understand something. This is not physical confrontation. Paul fought those battles with Scripture and with correct doctrine. The way Paul shut up a mouth was to talk it down with solid doctrine. He challenged Titus to shut these false teachers up. Listen, he's teaching him that because of what is at stake. First and foremost, the truth, correct doctrine. Secondly, the church. Give me any church you've got that has two people who are with a large amount of authority, and there's going to be trouble sooner or later, unless they are working together and see everything the same way. The minute one of them begins to teach something different, it is fixing to blow up. Every single time. What's at stake is too big for power to just be out there with, quote, anybody. It's not the way church works. I'm all for members having power. You know, we have business meetings here. Our people get the opportunity to vote on things. We talk about things like that. But if I ever had a member come up to me and tell me that they wanted me to change my ideas on something, well, either they're going to leave or I am. Because I'm not changing my ideas for anybody unless I can be proved wrong. If you prove me wrong, I'll change my ideas. But I'm not going to change what I believe the gospel says for anybody, and especially someone who wants to compete against me. Okay? So here what you're seeing, these false teachers are always in it for their own gain. As I've said, we always think of, quote, filthy lucre, if you will, money. But there's so much more. There's power and glory and just all of this different things that people seek. Look at verse 12. One of them, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. That's going at it pretty hard. But here's what this is about. Most theologians agree this is most likely a reference to the famous Cretan poet Epimenides. Big long word, Epimenides. He was born around 600 years before Christ, and he once characterized his own people, the Cretans, as being the lowest form of all Greek culture. So he was not a big fan of his own people. And I found this summed up in a way where it finally made sense to me. Have you ever heard someone say someone was a Cretan? I have. And to be honest with you, never really knew exactly what that meant. Okay? Here's the way this person summed it up, and it helped me to kind of understand it. He put it this way. He said, as sodomy refers to the sin of the sodomites, to be called a Cretan became basically almost synonymous with being a liar. Because the Cretan people, apparently, according to one of their own most well-known prophets, were, what exactly did he say there? Liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. This is how one of their most famous poets described his own people. So to be called a Cretan, I guess if anybody ever calls me that now, I'm going to know they're insulting me. But I probably wouldn't have that much before. And here we're looking at people who are too lazy to work and who you cannot trust. So let's face it, if somebody calls you a Cretan, they're not giving you a compliment, okay? So as I said, Titus is going to face these Judaizers, and he's also going to face false, quote, Christian teachers, and then he's going to face philosophers. You know, in all of Rome and Greece, there were always the Socrates of the world. And Socrates is revered in our world, but these Greek philosophers thought a lot of themselves. And they basically would deny anything about the gospel because it seemed it wasn't like intellectual enough for these guys. You know, nothing has changed. Nothing. A lot of people today believe that the gospel is for, the poor and the lowly and the uneducated and blah, 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 blah. Well, I'm going to tell you what, that group does think an awful lot of it, and I'm proud to be one of them. I mean, I got a high school education, and but I'm not even sure I deserved to pass it because I just didn't care at the time. So, and just like a lot of my friends, I grew up in Marshall County. You didn't worry about school because we all any of us wanted to do was get a job at the plants at Calvert, because they had guys down there they hired who could not read or write, who worked there for 40 years. Now, I'm sure many of them learned to, but they really didn't care. Or you could go to General Tire, where a weak mind and a strong back was a very good thing to have. You didn't need a strong mind. They would tell you what to do, just don't hurt yourself if you're lucky. You look at intellectuals today, how many colleges do you believe today have high-ranking professors who are believers? Basically, almost none. When you go into a college today, you're looking at a group there, for the most part, who reject God. We may be a little better off around here. I actually used to have a Murray State professor in my Sunday school class, if you can imagine that. It was really funny one day because I used a fancy word, and my brother, who was in my class, laughed at me because he thought I messed it up. And so I just turned to her and I said, "Did I use that correctly?" And she said, "Yes, you did." And I felt really, really good. I think I used the word dichotomy, and I don't believe I had ever used that word. I'd heard it, but for whatever reason, I throwed it out there, and my brother thought that I made something up, I think. So, he might have been right many times. But me and her talked about this a few times, and she actually told me that Murray State wasn't that bad. It's not really, doesn't have a reputation of what we know as a severely left-wing liberal college. But I want you to understand, do you know Harvard and Yale and most of those were founded as Christian colleges? They were started as churches, basically, who were going to teach young people education. And today, they are as far from Christian as you can get. It seems like the more a person knows, the less they're willing to respond to the gospel. And I think I have an explanation for that. And I think when you hear it, you may think it makes sense. It's really hard to be full of Jesus when you're full of yourself. And when a person starts to think that they are so intelligent, that they're above everyone else, they're so full of themselves that they have not left any room for Christ in their life. And that explains it many, many times. Verse 13. This testimony is true, therefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith, not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men who turn from the truth. To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure. But even their mind and conscience are defiled. Now, this is not, Paul's not telling Titus to be mean-spirited and vindictive and go looking for a fight. He's simply telling him, you stand and you do whatever you have to do for the gospel. Personal relationships are never as important as the gospel. They're not. Most people anymore do not believe this anymore. They really don't. If I've been called out for anything, it has been that. There are people, especially on Facebook, people I know, or at least somewhat know who I am, maybe even if I didn't know them. If I've been hit with anything over the years, it has been, why so mean? And I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. If you're going to preach about sin, there are people who are like, that's because most people in the back of their mind are convinced that sooner or later Jesus is going to save everybody. All right? That's what they believe. They believe in universalism. They believe that, they look back at their own family who's never spent any time in church, never worshiped God, but their granny was one of the sweetest people they ever knew. So when she passes away, she's going to heaven. As I said, everybody who dies on Facebook goes to heaven. Everybody. They all, quote, gain their wings. Granny died today. Heaven gained an angel, gained her wings. And then I've literally also seen people literally say, I bet Granddad is up there today drinking a beer, smoking a cigarette, and playing golf. Now, this is the way people look at heaven, okay? This is not about the beer or the cigarettes. It's about the idea that we're going to need golf in heaven. Deer hunters believe that there will be nothing but giant bucks in heaven and they'll all be stupid. They'll just walk by and let you shoot them. Golfers are convinced that they'll get a hole-in-one almost every time. Of course, fishermen, you throw your lure before it can hit the water, bass are jumping up in the air to catch it. Because why? Literally, some people today are afraid they're going to be bored in eternity if they don't have these things. Why is it today that probably 65 or 70% of Christian believers are pretty much sure that pets go to heaven? Because they don't think they can be happy without them there. Do they? There's nothing in the Bible to make me believe they do. I don't know. What bothers me is that people think they can't be happy if Fluffy doesn't go with them. I mean, I see people all the time. She's waiting for me now. And, in heaven, I'll be there soon. As if it was your mother who was a Christian who passed away. People say this about their pets. And it's pretty spooky. But there are people today who believe that we ought not call out sin, that we ought to make the gospel more attractive to people. No. That's Joel Osteen's job, is to tell everybody that they can have their best life today, while we've been doing a study in Job that says you can be the greatest man on earth and lose every single thing you've got. So, it's amazing to me. I saw a tweet this week from a fellow by the name of Stephen Furtick, who I am absolutely not a fan of, who has a massive church. And he basically said that when we were saved, we had finally came to the realization of what we had been all along in God's eyes. Boy, that sounds good. Except for, I thought until you were saved, you were a sinner. Now, maybe I've been reading wrong, but it looks to me like until the day you were saved, you were a wicked, you were idolatrous, you were a sinner. No, the idea of being saved is not that you finally realize just how good you are. It's that you're a new creation who is the complete opposite of the sinful you that existed before then. This is how easy it is to preach false gospel. When he says that, it sounds so sweet to the ears. It's literally, it's like sorghum molasses and biscuits when I hear it. The problem is, once you look at it and listen just a little bit, it is a lie. No. Before the day that Christ saved me, I was a worthless sinner. I did not deserve to be saved. I was not who God wanted me to be. I was his enemy. This is the kind of stuff that false teachers do. Paul here is telling Timothy to go into these congregations and correct error. He told him right off the bat, set in order things. In other words, when you see error, correct it. But as I've said, we as churches and as members, I sat in the pew for 30 years, basically, almost. And churches do not like to be corrected. We take offense to it as opposed to doing what Paul's telling Titus to do. Because if there is error in a church, everybody there has to admit that they had something to do with it because they put up with it and tolerated it. And in the end, the whole congregation is guilty. If they know about it and it winds up, they would rather die. I was reading an article today about a church that gave all of its money and sold its building and gave it to a street down the road because this church finally gave up. I don't know absolutely nothing about this church, but it would not surprise me at all to find out that error crept in there somewhere, and these people decided we'd rather die and close the doors than to admit we messed up. Now, the same Christians here, us, who can't bear the thought of being corrected, I'm going to guess that 99.9% of them believed that when they corrected their children, they needed to listen to them, right? I mean, these same church members who don't you dare correct me spent their whole life probably still bragging today about how, well, my kids, I made them listen. This is what we get into if we're not guilty. It spoke there about these Jewish fables, and this is talking about things like these dietary restrictions. When Christianity came along, when Christ came, he abolished these dietary restrictions. He abolished these ceremonial restrictions, but he said not one jot nor tittle will pass away from the moral aspects of the law. So yes, we still have law to live under. It's called the Ten Commandments. Those have never gone away. These Jewish Judaizers and dogs would come in and they would take the grace that Paul founded this church on and they would add works to it. They would add dietary restrictions to it. And they would add, I'm teaching out of Colossians in Sunday school. We're studying the exact same thing, just a different church. In Colossae, Paul said, you don't have to worry anymore about new moons and Sabbaths and all these other laws. And new moons, all that meant was, the new moon in the Jewish calendar, the new moon was day number 1 of that month. That's the way their months work. You had all these things you had to do on the new moon. All these, different things you were required of. Paul tells the church at Colossae, you don't have to do that stuff anymore. He told them at Colossae, eat what you want, drink what you want. Don't worry about those things are gone. Never did Paul say it's okay now to murder, to covet, to do all these things the Ten Commandments tell us not to do. Paul deals with this all the time. Let's look at verse number 15 and 16 and we'll close. But to the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, but even their mind and conscience are defiled. They profess to know God, but in works they deny him, being abominable, disobedient, and disqualified for every good work. Great truths in here. Here's the first one. When you are pure in Christ, all things are pure to you. That's what the Bible teaches. When you are defiled, all things are defiled. These false teachers, because they were not true Christians, it didn't matter what good they did. All they could bring a person was defilement. You see, under Jewish law, what you ate and drink and all these things would defile you. Think about it. You couldn't eat pork. You couldn't eat catfish. You had all these restrictions on things. If you ate that, it would defile you, and you now had to go and offer a sacrifice. If you ate pork, you had to offer a sacrifice because you were defiled, okay? In Christianity, Jesus said with his own words, it's not what goes in a man that defiles him, it's what comes out. Now, a lot of people today will say, okay, Jeff, well, that must mean alcohol will defile no one. That's true, a little bit. But if you drink much, what comes out of you is going to defile you. Because I know people today in a crowd, they are in complete control of themselves. And you give them enough alcohol, and they are the filthiest mouth, ready to fight people that you will ever meet anywhere. So don't tell me they didn't get defiled with alcohol, because they did. Plain and simple. You know, we now have freedom as Christians to both worship and to work for Christ. But we're not working to be saved. We're working because we are. Here's our big problem today with a lot of people. Christians should be known for what they do, not for what they don't do. And for years, the church fell into a whole thing of the way you can tell I'm a Christian is I don't do this, and I don't do this, and I don't do this. As I said, I had a man years ago, a great guy, thought a lot of him, but he gave me a book all about Baptists. The first few chapters was really interesting, and it was broken down to be taught in Sunday school, and they taught it at a local church down in Paducah. And he gave me a copy of it and said, I know you got that big Sunday school class. You may want to use it sometime. I got in there, and it had a lot of history about Southern Baptists, and it was pretty interesting. And then I got to a whole section of why Baptists don't. And the first one, why Baptists don't dance. And as the end of that book for me, I folded it up, and I don't know where I've got it now. But there ain't a single thing in the Bible where you can tell me where it tells us, oh, Christians can't dance. You know what? They may not be able to dance, but it ain't because they're not allowed to, okay? I used to be a good dancer when I had two legs that worked. Nowadays, I would not want to try that anymore. Here he says also, here's the second big thing. Profession and performance should never contradict each other. There's a lot of people who can talk a good talk, but if they don't walk the walk, they're contradicting themselves. I'm going to close on that because years ago, and I've told this story before, but I worked with an older fella who was a deacon. And the first time I ever worked with him, I hadn't been there but a few days. He knew absolutely nothing about me. And he was one of the most ill-tempered, foul-mouthed people that I ever met in my life. And after being forced over there to work with him 2 or 3 days, all I wanted was to get out of Dodge, you know. Now, sometime later, he found out that I was a layman speaker and all the rest of this, and had his pastor call me to come and preach at his church. After he found that out, though, I never heard him throw a cussing, screaming fit in front of me again. But when he didn't know who I was, he acted as if he did. He acted more like he hated God than he was a deacon. That is what this is talking about. If you can talk a good game, but that's how you act when the lights are off or when you're away from the preacher and all these other things, and my goodness, I'm going to tell you, being a deacon is one of the most important roles in the church, but that's one of the reasons it has been the most hated and talked about, is because there have been many of them like him over the years who have ruined in people's eyes what the office of deacon is. It's just like a preacher has ruined it for people when they have an affair or something like that. It's the same way. But I'm going to tell you, it was amazing to me, the difference in him when he found out that I was a Christian speaker than when I was just a new guy that got slung over there with him for a day. And here he was. All he could think of was, oh, they stuck me with one of these new guys. You could just tell he had this disdain, like, I shouldn't have to do this. I've been here 30 years. Let's face it, a true Christian, even though he knew he was going to have a hard day, would have tried to be nice to the new guy, that just got hired on. He certainly wouldn't have thrown a cussing, screaming fit in front of him. That's for sure. We got to be who we say we are when we're around other people, or they will turn against the church and they will turn against Christ. And there are millions today who have let Christians be their excuse. A friend of mine from growing up posted on Facebook the other day, I love God, but his followers, not so much. Now, there's a reason for that. I'm not going to say they're right, but they're right a lot of times. Would you join me in a word of prayer? Father, help us to be people who are what we say we are, that we are still Christians when we get in our homes, when nobody can see us, and that we still love you when there's no gain in it for us by being popular at the church, and that we realize that when we meet strangers, that every person we meet is a possible candidate for salvation, and that we ought to act like Christians, that they would be drawn to us, not repelled by us. And Lord, I have worked with many, quote, Christians over the years who have sent more people away from church than they could ever bring there. And in turn, sending them away from you because people think, why would I want to be like you? Lord, we thank you for Paul. We thank you for this letter he wrote us, for the great truths that are in it. Lord, as we leave tonight, we pray for safety for each one that's here and pray that we might all be healthy enough to be back here Sunday morning as we gather again for worship services. We love you, we thank you, and we praise you tonight in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. God bless you, friends. Thank y'all for being here. Facebook audience, thank you for joining us tonight. Hope to see you Sunday morning.